Here are some expert suspension tips you need to know to get your four-wheel drive set up properly for carrying what you need to carry. To do that, I'm back down at Tough Dog's R&D Centre. I'm going to be chatting to my good mate Simon, who has been building suspension here in the R&D team for 30 years. So it's safe to say he knows what he's talking about. Let's get into it.
Okay, so you need to do something about the suspension in your ute. Where do you start? The very first step is to figure out everything you need to carry and how often you're going to carry it. The reason why your four-wheel drive is riding rough and a huge contributor to a bent chassis is choosing the wrong spring rate. Today, we're going to put different spring rates in this Ford Ranger under load to show you exactly what happens and give you the right information so you can choose the right spring rate for your four-wheel drive.
To show you what happens to your suspension if you load it up with the incorrect spring rate, we're putting the standard Ford suspension back in the Tough Dog Ranger. Then we're going to put the canopy on and Simon's going to point out everything that's happening to that standard suspension and why it's no good if you want to load your ute up. Then we're going to pull these springs out and put the correct spring rate in, show you the difference and why it's much safer and it'll be better to drive.
Here we have the factory spring fitted in place, and what you'll notice is the three primary leaves are now fully engaged on the second stage, and also too is the bump stop. It is now fully engaged on the axle. Now what that actually means is this axle cannot compress any further than what it has done here. As a result of the spring being fully compressed against the bump stop, there would also be some pretty dynamic forces going through the chassis rail here where we're fully engaged. By fitting the correct leaf spring, it allows us to restore the bump stop gap, allowing the axle to move up and down, which is the design of the vehicle. At the moment, what we have here is a vehicle where the axle is trapped between the weight coming down onto the spring and the bump stop, which is engaged on the striker plate. While restoring the bump stop gap, it will also improve the vehicle's performance in braking. The reason why the braking performance will be affected by an axle that is trapped against the bump stop is mainly due to the axle hopping and fighting against the bump stop, almost causing like a slapping effect. We now have the 500 kilo constant load spring in place, and the one thing that you'll notice is we're now maintaining a 70 to 80 mil bump stop gap, which is super important. We also have doubled the amount of leaves in the primary stage and also in the secondary, and the primary stage is now just resting on that second stage just for that extra support so that we're not Wing the spring over the second stage. Droop being the axle falling away from the chassis, and it's super important to maintain that 60 to 70 mil of droop from ride height. We've put a yellow indicator mark here just showing where the shock absorber is sitting at the moment with the correct spring fitted in place and the correct load placed over the axle. The important part about this is ensuring that we have the correct spring fitted for the weight being placed over the axle. If the spring was too powerful, we certainly wouldn't maintain the 70 mil of droop that we have here now, risking the shock absorber to be frequently topping out.
Topping out and bottoming out your shock can happen if you fit the wrong length shock to your vehicle relative to the height increase of the springs you've put in. For example, a shock that's too short with an increased suspension height will be sitting almost fully extended at ride height, which means it's always working at the end of its range and you can damage the shock. Whereas fitting a shock that's too long for the springs you've fitted means it will fully compress before the bump stops do, which can also damage the shock. Your shock essentially becomes your bump stop. That's why it's essential to get the right length shocks to suit your vehicle at full droop of your suspension and full up travel. Okay, so we've explained choosing the right spring rate for load carrying, but how does that affect flex and off-road performance? We're out on the tracks because we want to show you that even if you get heavier duty springs, you're not going to lose articulation provided they're matched to the weight of the vehicle.
So here we have the next gen Ranger with the Tough Dog suspension kitted in, raised 50 mil. It has a 0 to 300 kilo spring. Springs matched perfectly to the tray. As you can see, we've taken that spring now to full articulation and the shock is at full travel. Really important to match the shock absorber to the leaf spring so that we ensure that neither of them run out of travel in the way that they're supposed to. And as you can see, it's the shock absorber that's limiting the wheel travel here, not the spring. So it's a bit of a misconception that by choosing a constant 500 kilo spring that it limits the down travel. And in fact, that couldn't be further from the truth. It's actually the shock absorber that dictates the full droop travel. So as you can see here, we've got a 0 to 300, we've got a tray fitted, we're at full travel here. Everything is well protected, brake lines and ABS lines. And on the other side, we have full compression stroke on the bump stop the way it should be.
So what we're saying is the right spring and shock combo should mean your droop is only limited by your shock length and your compression is limited by your bump stop, not your shock topping out, because that's what can cause them to wear and fail faster.
Next up, we want to talk about the difference here between the good old coil spring and the leaf spring. The core spring here being made in Australia, we're using a micro-alloyed steel. Important to note that the way we come up with a design for a coil is not just by the free length, it's also the thickness of the coil, the pitch between the wire, and also the free height. One of the other misconceptions is running a really tall coil and allowing that coil to come down to the correct ride height. And that would cause a lot of stress on the coil. And not only that, we want to ensure that the coil spring doesn't bind before the internal bump stop comes into play. A sign of that could be chattering in between the coils where perhaps the powder coat's been fractured from the coil spring binding. So again, we don't want to just run a super long coil and have that compressed down to the correct ride height. It will always come down to matching the correct spring rate to the vehicle's application. What we have here in front of us is a next-gen Ranger comfort spring. You'll notice that it has a delete on the second stage, just purely running primary leaves. And the idea of this is just to keep the leaf spring nice and linear all the way to the bump stop, just ensuring comfort. And again, we're giving the customer three choices here with leaf springs, being this is a comfort spring. We also do a constant load 300 and a constant load 500. And that's where we see the second leaf coming into play to support the primary leaves. Keeping in mind, if we were going to a heavier application where we're seeing a canopy or a steel tray, this is where we would introduce the load leaves to support the primary leaves, just so that we don't have the spring laying out too flat. So as we've seen, this is a single rate spring, nice and linear all the way down to the bump stop. Now, if we were carrying things like a steel canopy, a steel tray, we would option up for the second stage spring. And again, it's super important selecting the correct spring for the application of a steel tray. It's always been a bit of a misconception with airbags, when to use them. Do they make the ride too firm, or do they restrict the wheel travel on droop? So I thought we'd cover off today just on a few things. Firstly, the old poly bag here, made from polyurethane and designed to go inside the coil spring. We would run this coil as a minimum at 5 PSI and at a maximum of 60 PSI. The idea of this bag is just to top the spring rate up. So if you chose a lighter rate coil, or if you had the factory OEM coil and you're carrying an inconsistent load, this bag would be the ultimate solution. The important thing to note with the poly bag is that you take the bag to a maximum pressure of 60 PSI first before placing the load over the rear axle, and then taking air out of the bag until the desired ride height is achieved. Because we want the bag to actually grow in height rather than grow in width and being trapped in between the coils. The bellows bag is a rubber constructed 2-ply bag. Comes in different heights. We do a standard height application and a long travel application. The bag should only be used to top up the spring rate, not to carry the complete load. Carrying that can end in, well, we've seen that plenty of times now with chassis rails being damaged. The poly air spring is a great solution for vehicles like this Ram behind us here, where we're inconsistently loaded. The back of the vehicle here might be taking, say, 200 kilos of cargo, and due to the lighter spring rate, the poly air bag is a perfect solution. We can take the bag to 60 PSI before the load goes on, and then lower the PSI back down to the desired rake. Now, rake is how much higher the back of the vehicle is than the front of the vehicle. And ideally what we would like is the back of the vehicle to be around about 15 mil taller than the front. And also ensuring that the headlight trajectory is facing the road rather than the trees.
In summing up, you can see why spring rates are so important for your vehicle. Hopefully this video has given you the information you need to get your spring rates right. If you get them right, your vehicle will drive nicer, be able to carry a load much safer, and generally be much more enjoyable to cruise around in. Of course, if you're not sure, you can give the experts at Tough Dog a call and they'll be able to sort out your suspension spring rates perfectly for your full drive and what you use it for. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you next time.